Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be here. It's good to be here on the West Coast. We've been traveling the homeschool network for a few years now, telling people about our work at the Family Hope Center, and this is our first time on the West Coast, so we're excited to be here. My daughter lives out here, so it makes it special to be able to come back to this side of the country and tell people more about what we do at the Family Hope Center and how we can help you. So I'm going to start and tell you a little bit about the Family Hope Center, what we do, and we're going to start out with what our objectives of the talk are. So we're going to tell you, what is the Family Hope Center? Who are we? What do we do? How do we view and evaluate the brain and the development of children? That's something that we really want to help you to understand just in this short period of time right now. How do we do that? Particularly today, our topic is dyslexia and learning problems. So how many of you have children who've actually had a diagnosis, or you feel like your child has dyslexia from things and how many just have learning disabilities, not necessarily? Okay, so mostly, so learning, or how many of your children have both issues, learning not just with reading, which dyslexia is, but other issues as well, right? So we're going to talk about that and how that impacts the brain, how that impacts your child's development, what's going on in the brain. We'll touch on it. We're going to scratch the surface, but help you to have definitely a different view as to what's going on with your children. We're also going to talk about how we at the Family Hope Center help families to promote healing in your children and the modalities that we use for that, so that we can create a better outcome for your children, understanding where problems are in the brain, what's going on in the brain, and what are the proactive things we can be doing to change those things, and when should you do that. So the Family Hope Center, a little bit about the Family Hope Center. We're an international organization. We see families from 34 different countries we're up to now. We have, as a team, a large majority of us on the team have 30 plus years of experience working in the field with children with special needs and challenges, and working in the field of child development. We work primarily, our focus is working with families who have children who've challenges. We also can help just to generally help families to identify as you're going along and watching your child develop. How do you know when, oh, this is something I should pay attention to, or this is something that's just that normal stage of development and all children are challenged with this particular area, but they move through it, and when do they and how do they move through it? So I'm going to help you to understand that so that you know what is in the right time frame. This is some of our team together here. We are a team of therapists. We're a team of doctors. Our team includes the people who support us and behind the scenes. We're a big family at the Family Hope Center. We're not separate in regards to the admin people compared to the people who work directly with the children. We all work together. Everyone on our team and the families know our families. We want to build a relationship and help our families to grow and develop. So we work very closely together as a team. So we teach and we guide families to understand how the brain functions. How does it function and how does it develop? And then how do you evaluate that? Going along, how do you evaluate exactly what's going on in the brain? And we have a way that we're going to introduce to you right now so that you will understand that. We also, once you've evaluated your children, it's important to evaluate your child, know where your child is. So we're going to talk about that. How do you go through that process to know exactly where your child is? And then how do you then develop a joyful program, something that you feel like, okay, I'm doing it. It might be a challenge and it might be a struggle sometimes, but it's joyful because I know that I'm doing the things that are going to change my child and help my child to develop. And we develop it at home. I have done program with my children, work with my children at home. I'll tell you a little bit about that in a minute and show you a little bit about our family. So we help families to implement a program at home. So we love the population of homeschoolers because you're already at home with your children. You've already decided this is what you want to do. You want to be with your children, you want to be at home growing them and developing them in your homes. So you've already made that first big step of what it's like to be at home, and we're helping you to know what can I do and do the right things to help my child at home, rather than I'll try this and then I'll try this, and do I really know and understand if this is really going to help my child? And so working together with families, we can dramatically improve the outcome of the children. These are the types of children that we see. The list is long. Okay, and it goes on, and you can see at the bottom here we've listed, starting with autism, ADD, ADHD, obsessive compulsive language problems, learning problems, dyslexia, reading problems, anything to do with the brain. If there's something going on that's challenging the development of a child or an adult, we work with the whole range, doesn't matter how old, although most of our population is in the children's, pediatrics area, we work with all ages, teenagers, adults as well. If something's happened to the brain and consequently development has gone backwards or development is not happening and it's due to the brain, then our program will help to address that in one way or another. This is the Family Hope Center here. We occupy most of the top floor of this building. It's not a typical office, as you will see. We have a waiting room, which is more like a living room. We greet our families when they come in the morning. We want families to feel comfortable. As I said, our families come from 34 different countries. So just in this group alone, I can see a Danish family, I can see a Russian family, I can see an Austrian family, and Americans. The Americans have it easy when they come to our office. The other families are traveling long distances to bring their children to us for us to be able to help them and guide them with the next step of their child's development. So when they come in the morning, we greet families, and we then go ahead and work together with the family to help to evaluate the child together with the family and then to develop a program. It's usually a 2-day process that we go through directly when we see a child. And families return to us every 6 months to get the next update for their program, go home at home, and we support them at home as they go along with their program. We continue to teach. Teaching is our focus. We want families to understand what's going on in the brain, so we teach at the office in small groups with videotapes or live, depending on what's necessary. Sometimes children who are local come in and get started on one part of the program. This is a little girl who came in and started with one of the programs that we use at the Family Hope Center, which can be quite significantly helpful to children who have the diagnosis of learning problems or dyslexia. This program is based on Tomatis, or it is one of the Tomatis programs called Listen. So if anyone's heard about that, that's an audio program that helps develop the audio processing parts of the brain, which are important for language development, understanding language, and also, of course, reading. This room is a room where we have all our equipment. Many of our children don't move, so we have a program for those children who are not mobile to go through the natural stages of development in their mobility, but they need equipment. What typically children have is just a floor, and that doesn't work for a lot of our children, so we have to re-engineer the brain by using different pieces of equipment. It's pretty straightforward that not every family has to have all of this, but this is our sample room where we show families how to use different pieces of equipment that can be helpful for their children at home. We also do hyperbarics, where we recommend this as one of our parts of our program. So when families come into the office, we have a few sample hyperbaric, mild hyperbaric chambers that for some of the children, it's going to be helpful for them, and families get to experience that when they come to the office. And we have a playroom and another therapy room that children also use. We have murals all around the office. It's not your typical office. It's fun, it's colorful, and to make every family feel comfortable, and a place where families can gather together and eat. So let me tell you a little bit about how I started with this field, and a little bit about my family. I started in this field in early child development, and I always wanted to work with children with special needs. As a youngster, I had a cousin who had special needs, and I spent a lot of time with her and had quite a relationship with her, and that's where my passion began. Everyone on our team has a passion and has a different story they come with of how they got into this field. So when I had my children, I knew about child development. I was already in the field. I'd already been working for quite a few years with both typically developing children and with children who were challenged in their development. So my children came along, and this is my eldest right here, Benjamin, and he developed really well. He had a good birth. He was a healthy baby. He was born a little bit early, but he seemed to do well, and we were able to do the right things to help promote his growth and development, and he did really well. He said hi grandma to his grandmother at 8 months of age when she walked in the room. She just about fell over. So he was very advanced in his language. He was speaking full sentences, clear conversations back and forth by the time he was 2. Had a very strong language center of the brain. By the time he was 6, when we'd go to church, he'd pick up the Bible out of the pew in church and look through for the stories about what's happening with Daniel. I want to read the next thing that I didn't read last week, and turning to his favorite stories. So he could read anything by the time he was 6, 7 years of age. So very, very well developed, and putting the right things in place really helped him to grow and develop, and giving him opportunities and pacing his development in the right way helped him to do real well. Our second child, Shayna, was born when she was about 2.5 years later, and she did seem to do really well. She was an at-home birth. She seemed to be a healthy baby. Benjamin had a bit of a reaction to one of the immunizations, so we decided to wait for her immunizations, and she had her first immunization a little bit later. We didn't have her immunized until she was 11 weeks of age, and we were a little concerned because of the reactions that Benjamin had had, but the doctors reassured us that she would be fine, and she wasn't. We watched her neurologically unravel. Knowing what we know, we knew what we were looking about, we knew what typical baby movements were, and we knew what vision looked like, and her eye started to turn in within 24 hours, and one side of her body got very tight. And her focus and her attention and her awareness was not what it had been 24 hours before. So we saw neurological deterioration after she had her immunization. And obviously we were concerned, but the good news was we knew what to do. We knew, okay, we've got a neurological problem here, but we know what to do, and we know how to help her. And we know the things that we need to do to help her to get through this and to grow and develop and be the best that she can be. It affected all parts of her brain. So she slowed down in all of her development. Her mobility slowed down, and that was the part that eventually caught up the fastest, although there was always a delay in her processing. When we would watch her, I'm sure many of you you watch your children when they're doing things, there can often be a delay in something that you're presenting them, and they're slower at processing something you say to them or outputting something. And we could watch her when she was together with other children, we could see a delay. She'd be one step behind. She had a frown on her face for quite a few years, and we could just see that tensity where she said, I'm just really trying to figure this out, and how come, and she actually expressed to us later on in life when she'd be in small groups with other children, I didn't understand why they got it and why I didn't. I couldn't understand what was going on in the classroom. She spoke when she was 3 and she was speaking, I was her translator. She could speak a good amount by that time, but nobody could understand her but me. Once her language the words became clear to be understood, I still had to translate what she was saying, because I'd know, okay, she told this piece of information and I'm going to fill in the gaps for whoever she's talking to, because it was disorganized. If she went to a friend's house and watched a movie or experienced something, when she came home and explained it to me, I could not figure it out. Unless I'd been there, I couldn't figure out what she was trying to say to me. So quite challenged in the language area. Language, as we'll talk about, is very related to reading. Reading is that visual piece of language, and she struggled with reading. She couldn't recognize her name when she was 7. So we were doing all the right things neurologically to help her, and over the years she got better and better. The process was slow. It felt for many years that she was this close, but she was that step behind always. But she did well, and by the time she was 12, 13, things started to come together for her, and her reading got better and better, and her learning got better and better. She struggled somewhat with math still, so when she went to college, she decided not to do something that involved too much math. She actually, when she first started her first college course, which she took because she was homeschooling at the local community college, she decided to take history. And I was like, history? That's a lot of reading, but didn't want to discourage her, let her do that, and she got through it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk more about reading. But she did very well for herself. She managed to do well, and she went to high school for her last 2 years of high school. She decided she wanted to do that. I'm ready, I can take on the social challenges, and I'm ready to learn in that group. So she was homeschooled up until that point. And she Eventually went to school in Philadelphia. She graduated from Temple University, came out here to Los Angeles, graduated from UCLA, USC with occupational therapy, a master's and a doctorate in occupational therapy. So she is now working up at Stanford University Hospital in the pediatrics critical care department. So she has gone from being the person who needed the care and the help and support. She understands it well. So there's that blessing that comes with challenges. When you have challenges, then you learn a lot about yourself. You learn to help others as well. So she's in a similar field to us, although working with a slightly different population. Not so much long-term therapy, but the short-term therapy and helping parents to manage their children. She said, I get to do the fun part, Mom. If the child's feeling well, I go in for an hour every day and we get to play. So she's not the one who has to stick the kids with needles and things like that. But so she has obviously done well. Our third child, but I think you can see that she's not biologically ours. She was adopted when she was 5 months of age. She had her own challenges as well. Not so typical of the children that were represented in this group. Shana was a little bit more typical in regards to the challenges that you see. But how many of your children, in addition to having problems with learning and language, also have social challenges? Knowing how to fit in. Yeah, so some of you do. And we're going to be talking again later today, and we'll address some of those things a little bit more. But often when you've got a neurological problem, you don't usually just have one clean thing. You don't just have, okay, I just can't do this one thing. It affects the brain in multiple ways. She had learning problems as well, challenges with learning, slightly different than her sister did. And we had to work with her with many of the same things, but in a different way, coming at it with different angles. She has also done very well, and she went to high school for 3 years, unlike her sister. She traveled with us a lot and got to experience life, was homeschooled up until through 9th grade, went to high school for 10th, 11th, and 12th grade, and she has now started started college. She's at a local college. She's playing basketball. She has a basketball scholarship, and she wants to be a nurse or a nurse practitioner. So she's on the healthcare track. When she graduated, actually while she was still in high school and working in high school, she wanted to become a firefighter. And she wanted to go to college for that, and we wouldn't let her until she finished high school, said focus on your high school things first. For her first summer free from school, she went to college and became a firefighter, and she's a certified firefighter in our community, and loves helping and going into places where she can help, and so she's gone through those social challenges from being a challenge to being someone who serves. So let's talk about our topic a little bit now. So you have a good idea that I know where you've been. I understand what it's like to have a child who's struggling, who's challenged with different neurological problems, and often for your children they look okay, right? Most of your children probably look okay, or many of them look okay. It doesn't look obvious, but you see it at home when you work with your child and you sit next to them and you're trying to help them, and you see the agitation and the challenges. So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in their brain and what's happening to them. So dyslexia, according to the dictionary, is a condition in the brain that makes it hard for a person to read, write, and spell. That's what the dictionary, Merriam Dictionary said. And the Wikipedia says it's a developmental or a reading disorder. And it's characterized by difficulty with learning to read fluently and accurately, and the comprehension. Okay? So there's our definition. Just a few statistics here. Illiteracy statistics in this country, in the US, and this is typical in most developing, most countries like the US, this would be the same in most countries in Europe and so on. Adults who can't read, about 14%. And that typically means that they can't read appliances or instructions to be able to manage, okay, I just got this new appliance, how do I use it? I can't read the instructions to figure it out. The number of US adults that can't read, this is the latest statistics that is 32 million. US adults who read below the 5th grade level is 21%. Percent of prison inmates who can't read, 63%. Percent of high school graduates who can't read. So those students are just pushed through or don't know the system doesn't work for them. And we'll talk a little bit more about why that is in a group and why can't those children learn. We believe and we know it's the brain. They're coming at it from the wrong angle, trying different ways to patch things up or work around, but it doesn't work if you don't address the brain for the children. So this is out of the US Department of Education Institute on Literacy research, which came out in April of 2013. You can find these statistics. They vary. Sometimes it says 40 million adults can't read. Sometimes it says 44. It varies depending on which statistics you're looking at, but that's the latest from last year. A couple of other facts. 2.4 million students in the US alone have some form of learning disability. Another statistic that I found says 44 million, as I said, adults can't read enough to read an appliance. And this, California builds its prisons based on the 3rd grade reading level. Some people say that, oh, well, that's not true. But if you go on the internet, there is some truth in that. And if you want to read the whole article, it was spring of 2012, a newsletter from Nevada Department of Corrections. And if you look at what it costs us to keep an inmate, the average inmate in prison is $47,000 plus a year to keep someone in prison, compared to what is allotted to a student who is in school. It's $9,000. Some $9,900 is the average. It's higher in some states and lower in other states. But you can see where the balance is off. We need more help, we need more support at the lower end so that we don't end up having to pay for those students who end up in a place where we obviously don't want them to be. What are the reasons why? It's complicated. There's a lot of reasons why children are labeled with dyslexia. So dyslexia can be a laterality problem. The laterality could be vision or it could be auditory. So meaning that there's a message that's in the brain and the child isn't right-sided or left-sided. There's mixture. Sometimes they read with their left eye. Sometimes they read with their right eye. Sometimes they hear through their left ear and process that way. Sometimes they process the other way. And consequently, there's disorganization and switching going on in the brain, which creates confusion. It could be a language problem. It could be a memory problem. You present a word today, and they can't remember it the next day. So they have a memory issue. It could be a visual problem. Can't track well along the page. Again, visual laterality, using the eyes together. They're not using their eyes together well. Could be an auditory problem. They don't hear the sounds of the words. The phonology of the sounds kind of mush together or spread out, and they just can't hear those sounds. So we're going to talk about each of those things, and they can't define the sounds. They can't match the sound that they're hearing with what they're visually seeing. So any of these can be a factor. Often, many children have all of these things or a combination. So what do we do about that? That's very complicated if your child has all of those issues, and what's the main one and what should be addressed first. Contributing factors to causing dyslexia, anoxia at birth, or some other kind of trauma, a difficult birth. For our daughter, of course, she had a reaction to her immunization, some other physiological condition which is causing the child not to do well. They're unhealthy, maybe have a heart problem, so consequently didn't have a lot of oxygen to the brain. Now it's affected the brain, and the child is having problems along those areas. And then, multiple reasons why there could be issues there. Now let's start unpacking reading, and what do you need in order to be a good successful reader? Because we need to know what's supposed to be happening in order to be able to then promote that in our children who are struggling and getting stuck and having challenges. You need really good vision. You need to be able to see well. You need to be able to see the words well. You need to be able to see the words move as you move your eyes across the page. You need to be able to move your eyes across the page and down. Those are important things. You need to be able to hear really well. Hear the language, okay? You need to have good stimulation. So if you were never presented with reading, then you're not going to learn to read. Our brains are wired to develop language, to be around people who are talking, communicate. How do we talk in this society? How do we talk in Russia compared to how we talk in Japan or China or here in the United States? That's stimulation. If you don't talk to a child, they're not going to learn to learn to speak. But of course we live in an environment where we talk and we communicate and children learn language, and our brains are wired for language. But we need to be able to stimulate for reading and teach reading. Then you need to be able to take all of that, the amount of stimulation that you've had, your hearing and your vision, and integrate it together really well so that then you can then read, so long as you've got that good organization. But if you're not well organized and your brain doesn't integrate it really well, then you can run into challenges. So there are many areas of the brain that are activated when you're reading. It's complicated, and it can be efficient if it's working really well, and it can be very inefficient if it's not working well. And if any kind of issue can slow down that reading process, can stop it, and cause there to be bumps along the way as your children learn to read. So what do we want to do first when we're faced with a child who is struggling with their reading? First thing you want to know is what's going on. What neurologically is going on with my child? How am I going to evaluate my child and know exactly what combination of problems does my child have? Do they have all of the combinations? And if so, which one should I address first? What's the one that's kind of glaring out and we should handle? Should we handle the vision first? Should we handle the auditory piece first? How do we figure that out and pinpoint the problem? Well, at the Family Hope Center, we've developed a way of evaluating children, which we teach to parents. So we're here, I'm going to give you a little bit of a taste of that right now. We can tell you even more about that if you come to our booth or be in communication with us. We'll explain more about how that works. And we have a 3-day parent training that we teach parents how to be able to do this, how to fully evaluate your own child at home and know where your child is. So I'm going to give you just the highlights of this developmental chart, which covers all areas of function and the different parts of the brain. We've got one up here if you want to have a look at it. It's down the front here, and we're going to look at some of the different components on the PowerPoint right now. With this chart that we developed, we're looking at abilities. We don't look at the disabilities. So while at home, what's glaring at you is, I just presented my child with this reading word yesterday, and here it is again, and he can't remember it. And you, of course, want to know why. That's the disability. He can't remember the word today that I taught him yesterday. What's going on? So the first thing we want to do, though, is evaluate the abilities. Where is my child? What abilities does my child have? And consequently, then I'm going to know what to work on next. We evaluate it according to brain function. So what functions does your child have, and what part of the brain is responsible for that? And it's very important, because that then helps us to know what do we need to do to organize that part of the brain, so consequently that function can improve or develop if it's not there at all. God designed this. We just observed. We've been in the field for many years, so there've been obviously a lot of influence from what we've read and we've learned, and just working with children and watching how a baby grows and develops. He designed us to naturally grow and develop in mobility, for example. Your baby's born, you put them on the floor on their belly, they can move on their belly first of all, then they get up on their hands and knees and they start creeping. Then once they've done enough of that, they stand up and they start walking. It's the natural way God designed us to develop, right? He designed that. We just wrote it down. And we wrote down exactly how did God design us to develop from one stage to another, and at what ages does that happen. The chart that we have has been scientifically measured for reliability and validity, and it should be published in a physical therapy pediatric journal later in this year. So I'm telling you that so that you understand that this is not just something we just put together. It works. We've been using it for 12, 13 years now, and you can see that children move through these stages, and we can target different parts on the chart to help them. So it will be, as I said, published in a probably physical therapy pediatric journal by the end of the year. So this is what we do with this chart, the chart that I showed you up here. We take this chart and we mark on it where the child's functioning. Okay, what areas is your child functioning well, and what areas are they not functioning so well? Where there's nothing written, that means that child has a good ability in that area. Where there's something written in, that means that it's not quite organized, or it's not there at all, or it's just beginning. And so we teach how to measure that and how to decide, okay, to what degree are there challenges. And then we draw a line at the end of it and we measure. The numbers here are the age in months that this child is visually. So you can see at the bottom there, this child is chronologically 64 months. When we average out all of their functional ages in vision, hearing, sensation, mobility, communication with language, the manual ability and the emotional and social abilities, those are all the ages that are listed to the right there, and we've averaged this child out at an overall neurological age of 30 months. Well, that would be okay if that child was 30 months old, but this child's 64 months. So we can see that this child's only growing at about 50% of what he should be growing at. And it's written down here that Darren has ADHD, but you could see a similar kind of profile with a child who has learning problems as well. So I'm going to now tell you a little bit about the different parts of the brain and explain to you what they're responsible for. So your medulla is your brainstem. It's right here, at the right down here. You can see it marked there. The lowest part of your brain sits right on top of your spinal cord, and it's responsible for all your reflexes. So a baby has lots of reflexes at birth. We have chosen some to put on the chart. We evaluate them all for children who come to see us, but there are certain ones that are important to understand. You can also see here on this particular picture, running up the side of the medulla, can you see that fat, thicker line up the side of the medulla there, which is called the reticular formation. It starts the medulla, it runs up the side and along the side of the pons. So I'll tell you a little bit more about the reticular formation in a minute, but I wanted you to be aware of that. So here are all of the functions that we have on our chart that the medulla is responsible for. And you can see here right at the top in vision, a light reflex. A light reflex would be, all of us have a light reflex. You should always have a light reflex. If the lights go down in this room and then they come back on again, our pupils will dilate to allow more light in when the lights are off, and they'll constrict rapidly when the lights go on. So there are several reflexes here. The Babinski reflex, for example, is a reflex you have at birth. To help you to crawl, you use your toe. The toe goes up for a baby, and they dig their toe in to crawl. And then as they start to walk, they move into a plantar reflex where the toes go down to grip the floor so that they can walk. So these reflexes are very important. If you have the wrong reflex, and the reflex doesn't fire the way it's supposed to, and it's not well integrated, you're not going to function as well. So it's always important to look at the reflexes and make sure that the children are well organized neurologically with their reflexes. So here's the reticular formation. It's a vital regulator in the autonomic nervous system. It helps with respiratory rate, heart rate, the gastrointestinal activity. It's an important role in sleeping and waking. How many of your children have problems going to sleep and sleeping well? Yep. So you've got that disorganization. They're also having difficulty with their sleep cycle. There's your reticular formation, not well integrated. It filters incoming stimuli, discriminates with things that are irrelevant. It modulates pain, and it has a major role in alertness and attention. How many of your children have difficulty focusing, staying alert and attention and having good attention? Yep. So for those of you children who are having difficulties with just staying on task and staying focused, it's got a major role with that. The Pons. The Pons develops between 2 weeks and 2 months of age. So there you see the Pons. So the reticular formation, as I said, runs up the side of the medulla and into the Pons. These are the functions of the Pons, and we're going to highlight this one right here, which is right up here. So the Pons is responsible for finding light in a darkened room. It's your vital part of the brain. You don't think with your Pons. The Pons just does. So if the light suddenly went out right now in this room, what would you do? Find light, somebody said, right? Yep. That's your Pons. You don't even think about, oh, the lights just went out. What should I do now? No, your cortex doesn't do any thinking. The Pons just says, find the exit sign. Find a crack under the door. I need to get out of here. It's dark. This isn't a safe place to be. So the Pons is responsible for helping you and saving your life. It has a visual responsibility. It has an auditory responsibility. If there's a sudden frightening sound, your Pons moves into action and tells you to get out of here, save yourself, move into action. It also is responsible for tracking people and tracking across the page. Okay? So it's very important for reading. It's how well and smoothly do I track across the page, back and forth across the page. So you can actually just check with your kids. Just take something and have them keep their head nice and straight and see how well and smoothly does your child track side to side. You'll probably find with many of your children that there's going to be some jumping. They'll be jumping at the midline or some shakiness. That's going to affect your reading, right? You've got to be able to read. And when reading gets more difficult at third grade, why does it get more difficult at third grade? Anyone know who's got... Sorry? Smaller print, right? Yeah, smaller print, more print on the page, and now I've got to track side to side. The cranial nerves come out of the pons. They actually attach right to the side of your eyes here. So it helps you, if they're attached real well, and they're well integrated, there's no pressure on those cranial nerves, you're going to track side to side really well. There's the picture of the eye. There's the lateral rectus muscle. That's where the cranial nerves that come out of the pons, the message comes from the pons through those cranial nerves to the side of the eye to track nice and smoothly from side to side. This is crawling. So this is a child here crawling. Nice toe dig this child has in a nice cross pattern. So as babies go through a variety of different patterns, they use the same side of their body for a while, but once you're well organized and you're crawling well, you should crawl in a good cross pattern, as this picture shows here. Now the midbrain. The midbrain has some important things in regards to reading as well. The midbrain sits right on top. It's in the center of the brain there. These are all the functions of the midbrain, and again we're going to focus on right here on details, being able to see details. It's the meaningful part of the brain. When things start to not just happen just because, and the brain just says just react, it starts to be aware of meaning in regards to knowing the tones of voice. Oh, my mom's happy with me right now, my mom's not very happy, what was that sound? So not just hearing the sound, but really starting to know what sounds mean. And in vision, we start to see detail. We're not just tracking mom walking across in front of a window now, we're actually saying, there's my mom across the room, I need my mom. So I can see detail, I can see facial expressions, and when it comes to reading, I need to be using my two eyes together. So the midbrain is responsible to make those two eyes come together. If they come together really well, you're going to see a picture from your left eye and a picture from your right eye in reading, and those words are going to be very clear for you. If your eyes aren't really consistently working together, that can get fuzzy, or you might be seeing double. It can be very challenging with reading if you're not using your eyes together. And the midbrain is also responsible for the up and down movements of the eyes. So when I go from one line to another, so if you have a child who's skipping lines, reading things backwards, could be the visual convergence that's going on, and it also can be laterality, which comes a little bit of a higher level. So in sounds, as I said, you're starting to recognize voice inflection, you're starting to hear the sounds in the environment. If you can hear the sounds well and distinguish sounds in the environment, and you can develop that part of your brain where you're really able to distinguish all those sounds, you're going to hear the phonology of language well. And then you're going to develop your language part. If this part of the brain is not working really well, if you're not able to filter out background sounds and focus on what you're supposed to be paying attention to, because background sounds are getting in the way, or you're not able to distinguish those sounds, then that language is not going to develop as well, which is going to get in the way of reading. In the midbrain, the mobility action, so the pons is crawling, creeping is the midbrain. Children develop their ability to track side to side really well when they crawl on their bellies. They develop their ability to have good convergence when they get up on their hands and knees, because they start to be further away. They've got to use the two eyes together to be able to see what's on the floor in front of them, to be able to look up and look around. They need depth perception to start to be developed. And they have to use their eyes together in order to develop depth perception. So when a baby is creeping on their hands and knees, they develop that. The good news is you can go back to this. You can go back and do crawling and creeping to help your child to develop that nice, smooth tracking side to side and using their eyes together well. Now what about the cortex? The cortex is the mass right on top. It's your biggest part of the brain. And in the cortex, this is where you start to really think about what you're learning. And of course, there's language centers in the brain. So language develops in the cortex. We're going to go through this fairly quickly because I want to get on to a little bit more specifically about what's going on in the brain, show you some pictures of the brain. So this is the cortex level 4, level 5, level 6, and on to level 7. And we've divided it up. The cortex isn't really divided that way, but we divide it up for clarity that what functions come online at different ages as the child grows and develops. So obviously by the time a child gets to that age, they're starting to read at least 50 single words and simple phrases. So child with opportunity, by the time they're 6 years of age, they should know all their numbers and letters, and they should be able to read phrases. What's getting in the way of those children not being able to do that is some of those lower level things that are going on in the brain. And we also look at laterality, as I said, how well is each side of the brain working, and are we one-sided? So that's an important factor as well, often for these children. So this again is that typical chart that we would put together. We'd evaluate a child, or you would evaluate your child. We can teach you how to do that and give you materials on how to do that, so that you can then develop a program at home to move a child who has a chart that looks like this and development that looks like this, and move through their stages of development as they get more organized. This is how we measure the chart once we've done the full evaluation and looked at the child. So let's talk a little bit about the steps to independent reading. Reading first, it's a neurological function. As I said earlier, it's a neurological function. Your brain you need to be able to be taught how to read. Most of us didn't just pick it up by osmosis. Some people who are very well organized do pick up reading by osmosis, but most of us, just by sitting next to someone, they can read, and they can, if you're well organized and you're just sitting next to someone who's reading, you can actually pick up reading in that way. But not many people do that. Most of us needed it to be broken down step by step for us to be able to do this. So it's what we call a learned neurological function, rather than something that it just happens through us being around others. It's the ability to relate the sounds of language to the written word. So I can hear the word apple, and I see the word apple, and I know when I see that word apple, I can see that relationship there. And I know in my mind, oh, yes, I know what that is. And I have a picture, a visual picture that comes into my mind. I talked to my son once about how is it for him with reading. Because he was a good reader, I want to know what it's like for him. I struggled somewhat with reading. I'm still a slow reader, so I want to know what it's like for him, because I saw how easily, and he needed some help, but he picked up on it so much easier than both of his sisters. So I said to him, when you hear a word that you've never seen before, what happens? He said, oh, well, I see it. I can just see it right in my mind. I get the visual picture immediately. I said, when you see a word that you've never seen before, what happens? He says, I just know what it is. His brain is that quick. That's how all our brains should work. We should be able to take that visual symbol and be able to do that. And eventually it's being able to decode the words. So I come across a new word, I can figure it out by the sounds, because I know what sounds go in my language, and I can also, by the context of that sentence, I know what it means, right? That's the final step of being able to decode a word, and by not only know what it sounds like, but also know what it means in context. So we need, as we talked about, for reading, we need to have a really well-organized Pons for tracking side to side. We need to have a well-organized midbrain for convergence. Our hearing pathway needs to be organized. I need to be able to hear the phonology and understand environmental sounds. If your child doesn't understand environmental sounds, that's the foundation by which language then grows and develops. If I can understand, then I should then have good phonology of language. But if I've got things like I cover my ears a lot, that's a sign that if I cover my ears or sounds bothering me, that I'm not processing auditory sounds the way I should be, and consequently this part of the brain's not working really well, and that can affect my ability to process sounds and language as well. And then to be able to distinguish those sounds, to know the difference between a word like chair and cheer. That sounds very different for those of us who are well organized, and it looks different. But if you think about it, it's very similar in its sounds, right? We can distinguish it if we're well organized. If we're not, those two sounds and those two visual pictures are going to look the same and be really challenging for a child who's trying to figure this out. We also need to hear language at the correct speed. So I talked about how with Shayna, she was very delayed in a lot of her processing. And what they're finding with a lot of children, they used to be thought that dyslexia was just a visual problem. Now they're understanding more and more it's not just visual, it's much more complex. And it has a hearing component, and a lot of children don't hear the words at the correct speed. So for example, the word dog might take 40 milliseconds in a well-organized person to process. But a child, and you can see the breakdown there of how it's broken down and what goes on in our brain. But if we don't have that, we might take much longer. It might take us 150 milliseconds to process that word. Consequently, the next word's kind of coming on top of the word from before, and that's why it's hard for me to spell and to write, because everything's just mixed up as what's going in and what's coming out. If we've got a really well-organized link with speed and organization with the visual and the hearing pathways, I'm going to have good reading comprehension. I'm going to show you a picture of how early readers use their brains and what parts of the brain they use and what happens when you're really well organized and we become more proficient. First of all, just here, so early readers activate the occipital lobe. That's your lobe back here. It's responsible for the visual picture. So that's at the back here. And the parietal lobe and Broca's area, which are language areas. Then skilled readers use the occipital lobe, the occipital temporal lobe, and their frontal lobe. Your frontal lobe is for meaning, critical thinking, meaning, what am I reading, how much do I understand from what I learnt before, and starting to tie things together. If you're still at that first stage of really kind of muscling your way through words, there's no way you can start to use your frontal lobe for meaning. You're just getting through the paces and working really hard, but there's no ability to think at that point. Now, science now is able to show us on functional MRIs, and there's so much more we can learn about the brain, but there's a lot of work being done and has been being done in the last 10 years or more to show what's going on functionally in the brain when someone is reading. And it shows what's happening with a struggling reader who's disorganized and what parts of their brain are being used and why does it seem to be inefficient. So if you look at these two pictures here, the one on the left, you can see the child who has been labeled with dyslexia has a lot of activity on both sides of the brain. Okay? Look at the efficient reader. It's like, for the dyslexic reading, it's like crossing one of those highways that you have here in Los Angeles, right? And you have to go across a major highway, and they're constantly going back and forth across that highway. How efficient is that if you're driving and you keep changing highways, right? Changing lanes in the highway. If you stick on one lane, you can be nice and efficient and you can get there, and you only move over if you need to. So the child who is disorganized and he's trying to muscle his way through and use every part of the brain he can. And it's just not efficient. Every time you cross over, that from one hemisphere to another, you're being much less efficient. This is a picture of a group of children. There were about 50 children in this group who were disorganized and had a picture like the one on the left. There were interventions for reading which were helping with auditory processing, particularly with speed of processing and the auditory pathway, because these children were shown to have auditory challenges. After interventions, look what happened to the brain picture. The activity there is all on in the left hemisphere now. It's much more efficient. It's not exactly the same as the well-organized brain, but what has happened is because those parts of the brain were grown through a neurological program, consequently, the brain then just picked up other parts in that vicinity and used those other parts. I can show you here. If you see there, look at the good reader and where the activity is, and then here with the child after having reorganized the brain. Not exactly the same, but pretty close. And we're definitely efficient now because all the activity is where we want it in one hemisphere. So first of all, make sure that you know where your children are. Develop a really good evaluation. And our chart can be one way, but be sure you know exactly what is going on with your child's brain and why are they struggling with these things. And then you want to, if you're going to help your child then to learn to read, you then want to step in with the right neurological program that's going to change the brain. Just practicing reading over and over again is just not going to help your children. We see that from the statistics of what's happening in the education system, where they're working on reading, but they don't have that neurological piece in school. You keep changing the method. So how many of you have changed your methods of teaching your children to read more than once? Yes, right? Okay. It's not you. It's not the method. It's not the curriculum. It's your child's brain. If you start to target the brain, your child will learn to read. That doesn't mean that some children don't need a little bit more phonics and some children need a little bit more sight reading. We've got to balance that, but first address the brain. So crawling and creeping is going to organize the lower levels of the brain, which sets a good foundation for learning to read. Stimulating with auditory programs to help the auditory process. If you evaluate your child and they have auditory issues, there's programs out there. These are the programs that we use at the Family Hope Center. They're also available. What we find, just to caution you, if you start an auditory processing program and you haven't addressed the fundamentals and you're not doing the right things neurologically, they don't work so well. Okay, so they work better if you've got all the pieces in place. So Fast Forward is a very high-level auditory program, which I use with both of my children. I use it with several of the children in our office, but it's not the first thing. It's the last thing. It finishes things up. So for very mild challenge issues, it can be the right thing. For most children, they need really low-level neurological organization first, and then these things like ease and listen and fast forward are added as part of the process as you go about organizing the brain. And nutrition, so important for children to have a good nutrition. Okay, most of the children that come to the Family Hope Center, we recommend gluten-free, low carbohydrate diets, dairy-free, giving high protein, good fats, and good amount of vegetables. That's what you want to grow your brain. That's the food that you want more than anything. Cranial sacral work can help to open up. If the cranial sacral system is not really open and flowing, it puts pressure on the nerves that come out, those cranial nerves that come out of different parts of the brain to attach to the eye or wherever they're going, and they don't work so well if there's a slight bit of pressure. So if you can find a good cranial sacral therapist, certainly recommended. So once you're organizing the brain and you've got good healthy diet, what about your reading program? What are you looking at? So start with whole words, because it's going to grow their language part of the brain, which is what you want to grow first. Phonics is also important, but it's when should you start the phonics? If your child is really frustrated, I wouldn't do it. Look, okay, if he's really frustrated and it's not working and he's not getting them, then phonics isn't the right thing right now. Maybe in a year from now, maybe 6 months from now, maybe 2 years from now, it's finding the right time when you put the phonics in. Overall, you want to have a nice individually tailored program for your child and well balanced that's going to suit your child through each 6 months or year of development as you're teaching your child. So depending on your child, some children need more phonics. Our second daughter needed more phonics, and our first one needed more sight reading. We balanced the two for them to be successful. And be consistent. Start a program, be consistent with what you're doing, and you will find your child, so long as you're doing neurological things to organize them, will work through. They just need more time. Okay? They need more time, so be consistent and don't think it's not working. To give it enough time. The larger your child's oral vocabulary, the better they're going to be able to comprehend text now and in the future. So if your child can't learn the 10 or 20 words that you're trying to teach in the week, show them words anyway. Get good input through reading words, through reading to them, because they need that good auditory input. The more they see, the more they'll grow their brain. Eventually it'll start to come together for them, but typically what happens in school is that we teach less. The child's not doing well. Typically children go home with 20 words a week or 10 words a week, so the children who are struggling come home with 5. No, they should come home with twice the amount and just learn them. Input, not have to worry about the output. Greater input, you're going to get greater output. And it's also good to teach in related groups, because that way your child's learning. So you can say, okay, my child is still learning. My child's still learning, they're growing, they're developing really well. In regards to the auditory input, haven't quite got the visual down yet, but that's okay because at least they're moving ahead and they're not being held back because they can't yet read those words or those sentences or books themselves yet. We had to do this a lot with Shayna. When she took that history class, I told you I'd come back to this, when she took that history class in college, we found that the words that she would come to her brother or myself or my husband about and say, what does that word mean? Were words that she should have learnt when she was an early reader, back in elementary and early middle school age, okay? I taught her a lot of words, but I couldn't keep up as much as she needed. So she still had to fill in the gaps when she was later, but you can fill in those gaps now by doing a lot of input. You can't see this really well, but this is a child who was on our program. This was her writing when she came for one of her evaluations, and the story's okay, but it's a little bit disorganized. 6 months later, this is what she wrote. She jumped from writing, not just starting, barely writing in script, and the flow, although you can't see it, the flow of an organization of the story was dramatically improved. And this was just, and we weren't working on reading and writing because she actually does pretty well in this area, but it was one way to measure how children are improving, to get a writing sample every 6 months. We asked the children to give us a good writing sample and look back on what it looks like. So I do encourage you to do that because you'll be in the face of your children saying he's challenged and he's not doing really well, but he could be doing a lot better than he was 6 months ago. So keep those things on record so you can reflect back. Okay? So this showed us how well organized she was becoming in her thinking process and her ability to write. And her drawing had changed a lot too. It had become a lot more detailed. On the other picture you could see it was very basic, and she was now adding a lot more detail to what she was able to draw. So read till you drop. Enjoy this process. This is my kids when they were little.